Over the past 2 years, I've explored a collection of Digimon titles. What started as a simple admission of lust for the original Digimon world eventually evolved into an entire series of varying opinions. Annotations to each one of those are somewhere on the screen now. I had a vague idea of what games I wanted to cover and decided to take a few recommendations, which is why I put myself through the pain of playing Digimon World 4. Another suggestion comes to us in the form of this Sleuth video, as it was requested by more people than I can even fucking remember. So to all of you who did request it, thank you, and I sincerely hope you enjoy the review. As is tradition, we'll start with the intro and go from there. Upon starting a new game, you'll be greeted by this quirky, overly long cutscene which takes place in a chat room. I'm fond of the bubbly, colourful approach to an introduction, but it left me more confused and bored than anything. It serves solely to set up the fact that you have an online relationship with a handful of people, and that today you'll be meeting them in Eden for the first time. Eden being a virtual reality sort of deal where your consciousness is sucked into a computer and allows you to interact with people in a virtual space. I think the intro could have been shortened significantly, and the premise of the relationship addressed in a line or two of dialogue. Something along the lines of, "We've spoken for so long, it's nice to finally meet," as that establishes there's a long-standing, non-physical relationship. You're then prompted to pick one of the two genders that exist outside Tumblr. You can either be Digiqueer or Pan-Agumon. I'm not really a fan of either design here, but I need a male character so I could call him Digidick. Following this is a brief cutscene explaining the premise of Eden, which I've already briefly detailed, and then you're pushed into one part of the tutorial. A fairly small but recurring part of Sleuth is the ability to interact with persons of interest and feed them a handful of contextual keywords which prompt differing responses. It reminds me a lot of Final Fantasy II, but nowhere near as interesting. You start with one word and can gradually learn more, eventually finding the information you're after. It's an interesting concept, but more often than not boils down to finding the right NPC, using the correct keyword, and advancing as quickly as possible. The actual content of what the non-essential NPCs say is simply fluff and serves solely to waste time. I'm not sure if this was intentional to pad game time, or just a half-baked idea that somehow found its way in. Regardless, it's not interesting or engaging, and it would have been far less tedious if it was simply a standard interaction with an NPC. If I had to make it more exciting instead of simply brute forcing each option and making it a process of elimination with no fail state, I'd turn it into a puzzle. Without the alerts above NPCs' heads, you'd be forced to pay attention to what they were saying and actually give a shit about the information being fed. It could even be like a game of Guess Who, where you're given a certain amount of clues and have to make a judgment based on that. In the current form, it's certainly not intrusive, but seeing as you eventually assume the role of detective, I think the proposed idea would give the feeling that you were doing your job. After this, you transition to a new map, which is one of a handful of dungeons in the game, and get a nice little cutscene which blends 2D and 3D styles. I'm quite torn on this style because it does pop up in every major cutscene, and certain instances are done very well, to the point where I can't tell if it's fantastic 2D animation or stylized 3D animation. There are certain examples where it's blatantly 3D and looks like it was rendered in-game. When it works, it really works, but when it doesn't, it looks like a PS2 game. That said, it's still a fantastic idea, and the solid executions more than make up for the poorer ones. Not many art styles can take me by surprise anymore, but Sleuth somehow achieved that, and even with the mixed assortment of quality within, it's something I can't help but praise. Fuck, I'm still talking about the intro. Alright, let's speed this shit up a bit. So we meet up with our friends Sasuke and Sakura, or Arata and Nokia as they're formerly known, and there's a spooky scary ghost boy who comes along and tells us to pick a Digimon. The choice is between Palmon, Hagurumon, and Terriermon, and honestly, there's only one correct answer here. I quite like that they opted away from the conventional picks this time. You can't pick Agumon, Gabumon, Graumon, Vmon, or any of those other fucking mons. Of the three, you can pick between two Digimon that could never be mascots because one's a veiny plant and the other's 3 gears stuck together, and the third option is more or less an enabler for a certain type of fan Digimon may attract. Perfect! We gradually move toward the end of the tutorial section where we get tentacle raped and turned into a blob of blue shifting squares. Effectively what happens is that you lose your body as a result of being assaulted by the killer cephalopod, and your consciousness remains trapped between the two worlds without proper form and structure, while your body lies in a vegetated state somewhere else. It's not long before Best Girl rocks up in her car to offer assistance, whisks you away to a detective agency, and then enslaves you to a life of tedious detective work. The reason I talked about the intro for so long is because the game itself is massive. While it consists mostly of smaller maps, which get heavily recycled, you'll put anywhere from 40 to 80 hours in a standard playthrough, depending on which difficulty you select and how you approach side quests and the Digivolution Tree. But I'll come back to these shortly. You're then informed of Eden Syndrome, where a bunch of people went into the virtual world and never returned. Their bodies remain alive, but empty and inactive. Your physical body is in that very state, but your consciousness narrowly escaped being trapped, and you have this unnatural link to both worlds. This allows you to jump into a device to access Eden, or simply inside the device itself, which makes you perfect for a role as detective. From here, the game truly begins, and most of your time will be spent running around various Japanese cities, acting on behalf of this foxy minx as you solve crimes and investigate strange occurrences throughout both the real and digital world. I keep making jabs at how this chick's dressed, and that's because I adore liberal uses of sexuality and sex appeal in media, and Japan is no stranger to either of this. So when you present me with a young woman with fairly large tits, no bra, and a perpetual set of fuck me eyes, that makes my gaming experience all the more rich. Luckily, I'm not a prude, a puritan, or a social justice spastic, so I can appreciate stylized attire to fit a consistent Megaten-esque theme while also having a quick rub. I'm about to go into spoiler-heavy territory, so if you don't want that, there's an annotation on the screen right now. Click it, it'll skip past the story shit. It's like a minute or two at most. There's a lot more to say about the game that isn't going to spoil everything. In hindsight, probably should have put this at the end, but fuck you. 3, 2, 1, spoiler time, bitch! The goal of the first half of the story is to find out what Eden Syndrome is, and then attempt to cure it. The second half of the story quickly devolves into the usual beat the bad guy to save the world because they're all in grave danger. What pisses me off is that the first half had such an interesting premise. People are going into the virtual world and then permanently losing consciousness but remaining alive. That sort of situation could have been written so well, but instead a bunch of extremely powerful entities rock up to destroy the world and you either recruit them or destroy them and then you save both the worlds. That shit might have been interesting 25 years ago when Final Fantasy V came out, or like 21 when Dragon Quest VI came out, but they've been done, and it's been done so many times since. It seems like a cheap out for a story that stagnated towards the center and was on the verge of going nowhere. Luckily, they did do a few interesting things with it and didn't solely use it as a get out of shit story free card. At a certain point in the game, the digital world and the human world begin to merge, and not only does this cause certain chunks of the maps to be inaccessible and unstable, but Digimon start leaking into the real world. Some of the dialogue between NPCs in this section is exceptional and builds that fantastic character the Digimon series has briefly flirted with in the past. This is also where the environmental tone shifts, as many areas are set up to demonstrate the severity of the situation, such as groups of police encountering powerful Digimon and setting up blockades. I'd honestly like to see more of that, and less of pretty much everything else. Also, none of the dialogue choices you can select change anything. Alright, major story spoilers are over. Hopefully the annotation shits you out here. You can breathe again. It's okay, princess. Some of the dialogue during story sequences is hit and miss, and certain lines accompany a brief Japanese voiceover, but there wasn't anything major that removed me from the experience. Other than the incessant repetition of the label Cyber Sleuth and a few over-localizations, it was a solid translation. There were a handful of typos, and I noticed that the further into the story I went, the more typos I saw, but other than a lapse in QA, it's not a big issue. Now, I have to give a special mention to the character Jimiken. Jimiken? I think it's Jimiken. Jimiken! His design clearly derives from the band Kiss, and his English dialogue is fucking cancerous, full of lols and ruffles, but his spoken dialogue is fantastic. He screams everything and is eccentric, bursting with the raw, throbbing passion of 1,000 burning erections! He is simultaneously both the best and the worst character in the game. He's also where the major flaws begin to show themselves. I generally opt to play games on hard because I like a nice challenge, and often find that anything lower doesn't push me to play as well as I can. However, when I first encountered the Jimiken boss fight was when I discovered the first of many brick walls the game throws at you. Throughout my entire Cyber Sleuth playthrough, I don't think I ever came close to losing in any random encounter, and that was playing on hard until about chapter 19. Random encounters need tweaking because they're the least challenging things and are so bloody tedious. They give you a false sense of security, and then you run into a boss who absolutely wrecks your shit. Since Digimon took the Pokemon route with damage multipliers based on type advantages, you can often find that a tough fight may need an entire reconstructing of your team simply to progress the story. I wouldn't mind this if the rest of the encounters in the game were challenging as well, or at least something more than monotonous bores, and this is coming from a lifelong fan of JRPGs. There are also certain points in the game where another person joins the party, and as such, you're given an extra Digimon to help in battle. They rarely do anything and mostly serve as a free hit as they have infinite health, which can further trivialize random encounters. I'm actually quite fond of when a game throws a brick wall at a player as they're forced to get creative to work their way around it versus incessant grinding to brute force it, and you can certainly do that in Cyber Sleuth. Temporary stat boosts and status effects are a completely viable way to progress. However, because of the way the Digivolution Tree works, simply restructuring your party oftentimes requires grinding. I think the best way to approach this topic will be to briefly mention certain elements of the battle system, so do follow along as I'm building up to a point. When you start any battle, you get a percentage meter for each individual Digimon, which goes up by a set percent each time you encounter that specific Digimon. If they're a Babymon, it goes up 30%, in training it's 25%, and each extra stage of evolution goes down in 5% decrements until you get to Mega, which gives you 5% per encounter. When the percentage for any Digimon hits 100%, you can create your own copy of that monster. If you let it accumulate to 200%, then you get a very mild stat boost. When you obtain a new Digimon, they're given a soft level cap, and it's usually just enough to digivolve to the next stage. However, oftentimes you'll find yourself unable to move past a set level, and certain Digivolutions will require you be a higher level than the one you're locked to. This is where Digivolution comes in. You can revert a Digimon back to its prior stage at level 1 and you'll gain a stat called ABI, as well as your soft level cap permanently increasing. Certain Digivolutions, mostly Megas, require a certain ABI stat, alongside regular stat requirements, and some require an extremely high level for Digivolution, or an extremely high stat which may require a high level to reach. Constantly moving around the tree is pretty much a necessity, and it can become extremely tedious, especially when you're stuck and simply want to shake your team up a bit. On hard, I had to do this several times, as the game is quite long. It wasn't too much of an issue on the whole, but if you're looking for a quick change to your ranks, then it's far from ideal. I think the reason the evolution tree was so open and free was because doing this over and over, seeing the same Digimon time and time again, would have been fucking tedious. The way it's set out now is to maximize the amount of characters accessible to the player at any given time, and in that regard, it certainly works. My biggest gripe with it is that each transition puts that Digimon back to level 1, regardless of their level before. A simple fix would have been halving the level if you're going down an evolutionary stage, and having your level remain unchanged if you go up a stage. Even halving the level in either direction would be significantly less tedious than resetting it to 1. Other than the grinding, I do adore the freedom and accessibility of the Digivolution tree, even if it is a bit chaotic at times. There are 3 final things I want to gripe about, and I couldn't fit them anywhere else into the script because I suck, and since most people have probably finished watching by now, this is where we lose all illusion of professionalism and just fucking go for it. There are 3 types of side quests. The first type is indistinguishable from regular story missions, and I quite like those. You're assigned a task, you go out into the world, find the person who issued it, and deal with their problem. There are a handful of these each chapter, and they're probably the best part of the game. The second type are fetch quests, where you're tasked with trudging around the main dungeon looking for a sparkly on the ground. I'm pretty sure these are randomly generated and infinitely spawning, and they're fucking terrible. The final type is a proper subquest running throughout the entire game, where you must explore that same dungeon area for a random assortment of hackers and tell them to stop hacking or you'll call their mother. This is neat at first, as there's a predefined number of them, but they're not challenging, they're not hard to find, and it's really just a waste of time. The thing I dislike about most side quests is that it always ends in a battle with a rude human or a crazy Digimon, and after beating the living shit out of them, they beg forgiveness and everything goes back to how it was before. A complete lack of creativity or diversity in approach, and it brings the entire experience down. While traversing the handful of maps, there are various functions the player can call upon, which perform certain duties and are based on the makeup of the current active party. There are functions which control the random encounter rate, some being able to prevent random encounters entirely, which is unlocked after you have 4 Mega Digimon. I think by the time you have 4 Megas, you deserve to avoid random encounters entirely, and I wish more JRPGs would do this. There's a function which turns the player invisible and is used 3 or 4 times to move past guards. It's an interesting mechanic, and it wasn't fully realised, but it was still neat to have. Next is the ability to unlock gates, which really just gates progression until your party makeup is strong enough to take on the next part. Interesting, if a bit restrictive. Then there's the most useless shit in the game, even more useless than Nokia. Code Scan. Code Scan is to Cyber Sleuth what a signpost or an NPC is to a regular JRPG. Why this needs to exist in any form is baffling, as it generally serves to give hints towards puzzles that aren't difficult to solve anyway. Surely they could have had a regular interaction like a signpost or an NPC. Some things are staples for a reason, Bamco. And that leads us to the final command I want to talk about. Coffee. I need coffee. And it's not great coffee, but it'll do. Copy-paste is effectively what they've replaced switches with. There are coloured beam things, and you can copy the colour and then paste it into another beam, thus making an extremely bland colour-matching puzzle. Why this was even a function is fucking beyond me. Instead of having to have a certain party makeup and hitting square and then selecting the function, why can't I just press X on the object at any time to copy and paste respectively? Absolutely fucking baffling, but let's move on, this video's long. There's a Digifarm where you can store unused Digimon, and it very lightly treads back into the VPET territory. It took me about 20 hours to figure out how to use it properly, so to say it's unintrusive is an understatement. You can train your Digimon, feed them a various assortment of meat for stat gains, have them scope out new cases to Sleuth, or turn them into a child labour factory. It's a nice hint at what once was, and a firm statement that what Digimon was originally about has not been forgotten. In closing, I was overly negative in this review, but that's just me. I did actually enjoy most of Cyber Sleuth. It definitely was a chore at times, and I'd probably never play it again, but I'm happy I experienced it once, and once is enough for me. There's a New Game Plus mode, but nah, I'm good. If you're a fan of Digimon or JRPGs in any capacity, there is a lot to enjoy here, but they're still holding on to archaic design choices which bring it down to a slightly above average experience. It's far from bad, but there's still a lot of problems that need ironing out. I honestly think I would have had a better time playing it on Vita and not PS4. There's something about playing video games while you take a shit that just makes them better. And I think that's about it. I'd love to comment on the online functionality, but my PSN account was banned by Sony almost immediately after paying $80 for a digital copy of Cyber Sleuth. Thanks Sony, you absolutely incompetent fucktards! If you've got any problems with anything I said, that's absolutely fine. Let me know in the comments, because maybe I fucked up, maybe you disagree for some reason, maybe I missed something. Let me know. I mean, you're probably not even watching at this point. If you are watching at this point, let's have a little code word that people who didn't watch this far don't understand. Maybe something like, or something like that. Thanks for watching. I look forward to more Digimon requests in the future. That was a joke. Please stop, I'm dying. Thanks.